Hi, I'm Charlie Allison. I have degrees in history, communications, and an MFA in creative writing. I have written copiously about the back and forth of human sacrifice in an academic sense, and struggled valiantly but failed to master a nearly dead language, Nahuatl, which will be very helpful in our next talk, which involves a fluent speaker of Nahuatl, Temilotzin of Tlatelolco. And welcome to World History with Charlie. A lot of people like to play with counterfactuals, especially in the history, sci-fi, and fantasy world. There's a lot of thought experiments going on. But one of the most favorite vehicles for thought experiments is the time machine. You know, what would you do with a time machine? Would you go forward? Would you go back? But since we're talking history nerds here, we're definitely focused on going back. Going forward, no, that ain't happening. But a lot of ink and words have been spilled over the subject of time machines. And some people would prefer to go back and see how Alexander the Great defeated Cyrus at such and such battle. Other people would want to go back in time and see if Lucrezia Borgia was all that she was made out to be. And others, like me, after years of hearing conversations like this, came up with a different sort of formulation. My time machine is made up of exceptions. You know, when you take the standard dialogue involving a time machine, you say, I will go to X place for X amount of time. I will go there. My time machine is formatted, I will not go here, or here, or here, or here, or here. It is places I will never, under any circumstance, want to be for any period of time. And at the top of that list, in my time machine, is what is now Mexico City in 1521. Back then it was called Tenochtitlan, the head of the Mexica Empire. This is the last phase of Cortez's conquest of the Mexica, who are also called now in modern parlance Aztecs. It has no bearing in anything they called themselves, but it's catchy and it sells books, so we'll use it, I guess. The Siege of Tenochtitlan is a grueling, brutal, ugly 6-month endeavor that, I think the best way to phrase it is this time period's closest analog to Stalingrad, except for the Mexica Empire. Tenochtitlan, you see, was built in the center of a lake, and so control of the lake was critical, right? You had to have boats. The only other way to get there was through causeways, which could be pulled up or pushed down. And so, as you might imagine, it was very difficult for Hernando Cortez, the eminently trustworthy and definitely not shifty conquistador, and his majority native allies, who were chiefly made up of people who had once been Mexica vassals, but decided to throw their weight behind this new horse because he promised them they wouldn't have to pay taxes to the Mexica. Right? Regime change. It means you don't have to pay taxes. I mean, that's a pretty big incentive. And it was made up of people who traditionally hated the Mexica, like the Tlaxcalans. And the long story short is that they had the Mexica surrounded in the lake. Temilotzin of Tlatelolco was a Mexica noble, poet, warrior, advisor to the last of the Mexica emperors, Cuauhtémoc. It was a uniquely close bond between them. They'd been raised together as boys and sort of come up through the ranks together. The Tlatoani was an elected position, you see. And from the sources we have on the siege of Tenochtitlan, it looks like Temilotzin was at the forefront. There's a wonderful trope called authority equals ass-kicking, and it's very big in fantasy and sci-fi tropes. The person dressed in the resplendent eagle uniform, carrying a cedar club dotted with obsidian, has probably killed or captured a lot of people, as opposed to the guy in just a sort of light cotton jerkin with no decorations. And that's absolutely true for the Mexica military. The Mexica believed in intimidation through fashion and physically beating you nearly to death. You know, it's a good combo if you've got it. Temilotzin is at the front lines during the siege of Tenochtitlan. There were some near misses. Cortez himself was actually nearly captured on a causeway. He lost the two bottom fingers of his right hand, or left hand, I forget, getting away from it. He was very nearly sacrificed himself. At one point, some of his native allies almost deserted because this was taking a bit long, and they didn't see the profit in it. Despite all these setbacks, including a very funny incident where the Spanish, having run out of cannons, tried to build a DIY catapult to fire at the temples in the lake, and they pulled the triggering mechanism, just sort of fires the ball backwards, and was a rare moment of comedy for the besieged Mexica. The Spanish don't like to talk about that time they failed to make a catapult. Even with all those setbacks, time was on the besiegers' side, and their records of the Mexica eating their own dead, or the bark from trees, rather than give in. Cortez himself, in his letters back to Charles in Spain, writes that they didn't even look human anymore, but they still wouldn't surrender. That they seemed to be walking corpses. And this is before we count that Tenochtitlan was ground zero of a smallpox epidemic that killed as many as a fourth to a third of its population. Cuauhtémoc and Temilotzin, and the rest of the Mexica nobility, their elites, eventually see the writing on the wall and realize that they cannot possibly win this. So they do the pragmatic thing, pile into a canoe, and try to escape under cover. This does not work, unfortunately. What does happen, and what does work, at least for the Spanish, is that Cortez makes a very big show, after capturing them and the city surrendering, of publicly forgiving Cuauhtémoc. You know, what a good guy, that Cortez. And then, very shortly thereafter, finding that there is no gold that he had seen when he was last a guest in this city, left, putting Cuauhtémoc to torture. He used heated up irons to mutilate the Mexica emperor's feet, so he had real trouble walking afterward. What likely happened to the gold was that the Mexica, realizing that you can't eat gold and you're in a hostage situation, but you are the hostage, swiftly just threw it into Lake Texcoco because it's worthless weight. Fuck that. To which that offended Spanish moral sensibilities. You can't just treat gold that way. What's wrong with you? Sure, we're setting up a rape market over here, but you can't do that to gold. I'm not being hyperbolic. Bernal Diaz de Castillo, one of our best sources for the conquest, talks rather frankly about the process of selecting native peoples and establishing brands on their faces. It's an ugly chapter in history. So that didn't go as planned at all for Temilotzin and Cuauhtémoc. But Cortez has somewhat grabbed one of his hot irons in his hand, politically. He has to play sort of hot potato. On the one hand, he can't execute these captured nobles, even though he'd want to, because doing so might spark widespread discontent and rebellion against Spanish and Tlaxcalan rule. Tlaxcala is the traditional enemy of the Mexica, who were very happy to throw in with Cortez. It did not work out well for them either, for different reasons. But on the other hand, you can't keep them alive because they might escape and then foment discontent and rebellion against your rule. So what are you to do here? Cortez answers that question by functionally making Cuauhtémoc, Temilotzin, and the others members of his inner circle. And I don't mean in the team of rivals type way. I mean that he never went anywhere without them under armed guard. Right? They are under house arrest, but you have to follow Cortez around for the remainder of your life, functionally. It's a bit horrifying to imagine that. More horrifying still is what happens to Tenochtitlan after the initial sacking. Temilotzin doubtless was there for a protracted period of time and saw the temples and schools being torn apart brick by brick to build churches. This is unspeakably traumatic. I like to imagine an equivalent would be watching downtown Philadelphia, which I grew up, sort of inside of and have spent the majority of my life in, just sort of pulled apart, and all those distinctive buildings and all the memories and cultural echoes they have turned into weird alien shapes that I have no context for. And that sort of image might be a very tiny fraction of what watching Tenochtitlan become Mexico City would be like for Temilotzin. There are other indignities, but we don't have enough time to get into even half of them. Eventually, Cortez gets sick of the juggling act and decides that his best possible move is to go on a mission to a remote part, I think it's to the Yucatan, but I'm not sure, and then have Cuauhtémoc hanged. The pretense was that Cuauhtémoc had tried to escape again, although how a man with 2 severely burned feet is going to escape anything is anyone's guess. He hung Cuauhtémoc from a ceiba tree and forced Temilotzin to watch. Temilotzin, with the death of Cuauhtémoc, has very little left in the world he had grown up in and fought to preserve. Shortly thereafter, he and the remaining Mexican nobility are taken to a ship in the Gulf of Mexico, and their final fate would be to sort of be shipped off to Spain as curiosities. Not much of a life, really. Temilotzin was a poet in addition to a noble, and what poetry means in the Nahua world might be very different from how we mean it. It was typically performed to music, and because a song or poem was attributed to someone does not mean that they wrote it. It might be dedicated to or inspired by, but you could claim it as yours no matter what its origin. And Temilotzin's one surviving poem that we have translated is a poem extolling the virtues of friendship, which is not a typical Mexico war poem theme. Usually it's about the flowery death or the glory of battle. But this is almost rather soft and introspective. You could almost see it being a Nahua version of a ballad, almost. And the last couple of lines are very simple, but speak to how highly Temilotzin valued his friendship with Cuauhtémoc and his other peers. And it's very simple. It's, I am Temilotzin. I have flowers. I am sent from God. I have come to make friends here. And Temilotzin, as the ship pulled out into the Gulf of Mexico, doubtless looked down at his irons that he had never really been taken out of, and then down at the water and realized that he had absolutely nothing left. The Annales de Tlatelolco say that with that, he heaved himself over the side of the ship. And the translated Nahuatl is very laconic, and it says, "Nobody knows what happened to Temilotzin. Perhaps a big fish got him, or a shark, or a caiman. He was last seen swimming towards the sunset." Thanks.